My ex-husband told the divorce mediator I had nothing to offer. My attorney opened her laptop and turned it to face him. He asked for a recess before she finished loading the screen. Let me back up. My name is Simone Voss. I was married to Craig Voss for 9 years. We met when I was 27 at a conference in Denver where he was presenting and I was attending. He was confident on a stage in the specific way that men who've been told their whole lives that their confidence is a gift to any room they enter tend to be confident. He spoke in complete paragraphs. He made eye contact with the whole audience and somehow made each person feel like the eye contact was specifically for them. I was impressed. I want to be honest about that because I've had people ask me since everything came out whether I'd always known something was off. The honest answer is no. I was impressed for years. You don't stay in a marriage for 9 years without there being something real inside it. There was something real. It just had a ceiling I didn't see until I started getting close to it. Craig was a commercial real estate developer. Mid-sized firm, family founded, his father's name still on the letterhead. He was good at his job in the way that people who've grown up inside an industry are good at it. Fluent in its language, comfortable in its rooms, connected to the right people before he ever had to earn the connection. I was a financial analyst when we married. By the time we divorced, I was CFO of a logistics company with operations in 4 states. Craig thought I was still the analyst. That's the part that still surprises me when I sit with it. 9 years of marriage, and he had not updated his understanding of who I was. He'd watched me work. He'd seen the titles change. He'd attended the dinners and the events and nodded when people praised my work. But somewhere in his actual working model of our marriage, I was still the woman he'd met at a conference in Denver. Impressed, attending, not presenting. That model was about to cost him considerably. The marriage ended the way some marriages end. Not with one moment, but with the accumulated weight of 100 small ones, each survivable on its own and collectively not. I won't detail all of it here because most of it isn't relevant, and some of it still belongs to the private space between 2 people even after those 2 people are done. What is relevant is how Craig handled the end of it. The moment I told him I wanted a divorce, something shifted in him that I hadn't seen before. Not grief, not anger exactly, something more calculated than either. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "You're going to regret how this goes." I thought he meant emotionally, the way people mean it when a relationship ends and they're hurting and they want you to hurt too. I understand now that he meant it as a financial statement. Craig had spent the 3 months before I filed quietly moving things. Not dramatically, not in ways that announced themselves. Small restructurings of jointly held assets. A business account that had been jointly accessible that suddenly required his sole authorization for withdrawals. A refinancing of a property we co-owned that generated cash he directed into an account I didn't have visibility into. A consulting arrangement with his firm that he'd set up in my name without telling me, generating income that appeared on paper as mine, but was controlled entirely by him. He was building a picture. A picture in which the marital assets were modest. My income was complicated and partially directed by his firm, and the equitable split he had in mind was considerably less equitable than the law would otherwise suggest. He'd been planning this for 3 months. I'd been planning for 8. My attorney's name is Catherine Lim. She has practiced family law for 19 years. The last 12 focused specifically on high-asset divorce cases. She is small and precise and has the specific quality of stillness that means she has heard every version of every strategy and has stopped being surprised by any of them. She starts each client relationship with one question. What does he think you don't know? I sat in her office 11 months before the mediation session and answered that question for 45 minutes. Catherine made notes. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she set down her pen and said, "He's done this before." I looked at her. Not with you specifically, but this pattern, the pre-filing asset restructuring, the income obfuscation through a business arrangement, I've seen it. It requires preparation, and it requires someone who knows what they're doing or has access to someone who does. She paused. Does he have a prior divorce? His first marriage ended when he was 31, before we met. And the settlement? He always said it was straightforward. She walked away cleanly, his words. Catherine wrote something down. I'd like to look at that. What Catherine found when she looked at it was that Craig's first wife, a woman named Patricia Dunn, had walked away from an 8-year marriage with significantly less than the asset record of that marriage would have suggested she was entitled to. The pattern in the financial restructuring preceding that divorce was recognizable. Not identical to what he'd done with me. Similar enough to be a signature. He had done this before. He had refined it. I sat with that information for a week. Then I went back to Catherine's office and told her I wanted to make sure every single thing he had, moved, hidden, restructured, or redirected, was visible and documented before we sat down in any mediation room. She said, "That's exactly what we're going to do." Catherine connected me with a forensic accountant named David Ree, 17 years in financial investigation, the last 9 focused on marital asset disputes. He was methodical in the way of someone who understands that the story is always in the documents, and that the documents, if you know where to look, are almost always findable. David spent 6 weeks looking. What he found was comprehensive and, once assembled, almost elegant in its thoroughness. Craig had been careful. He was also not the first person who had been careful in front of David Ree. The consulting arrangement Craig had set up in my name generated $340,000 over 14 months. The income appeared on tax filings as mine. The actual control and direction of those funds was Craig's. David documented the authorization chain, the account movements, the decision records. Every step. The refinancing of our jointly owned property had generated $280,000 in cash. That cash had moved through 2 accounts before landing in a third that Craig had opened 18 months ago at a bank we'd never used together. David found all 3 accounts. He found the routing records. He found the dates. The The business account restructuring had effectively excluded me from $190,000 in jointly accessible funds over a 7-month period. David documented the access logs, the authorization changes, the withdrawal records. He totaled it. The number had a comma in it. More than one comma. I looked at the total in Catherine's office on a Thursday afternoon and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more useful than either. Clarity. The specific clarity of a complete picture after a long time of looking at pieces. He's going to walk into that mediation room thinking you don't know any of this, Catherine said. Yes, I said. Good, she said. Let him. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Neutral location, conference room on the 12th floor of a downtown building. Mediator named Robert Gaines, who had 20 years of family law experience, and the careful neutrality of someone who has learned that his job is to manage process and not take sides. Craig arrived with his attorney, a man named Philip Marsh, who was well regarded in commercial real estate law and considerably less experienced in marital asset disputes than he apparently believed himself to be. Craig looked good. Composed. The specific composed look of a man who believes he has controlled the information in the room. He shook hands with Robert Gaines. He nodded at Catherine with the minimal courtesy of someone who has already decided the outcome. He looked at me once, briefly, with an expression I recognized. The expression of a man recalculating someone against an outdated model and finding them smaller than the room requires. I looked back at him and said nothing. Robert Gaines opened the session. Standard framing. The purpose of mediation. The process. The goal of reaching an equitable resolution without litigation. Philip Marsh spoke first on Craig's behalf. He outlined Craig's position. The marital assets as Craig understood them. The proposed division. His framing of my income and financial standing. He used the word modest 3 times to describe the marital estate. Catherine let him finish. She thanked Robert Gaines. Then she opened her laptop, turned it toward the center of the table so that Craig and Philip Marsh could see the screen clearly, and said, I'd like to walk through the asset picture as we've documented it. Craig looked at the screen. Philip Marsh leaned forward. Catherine pulled up the first document. David Rees' Forensic Accounting Summary. Clean, formatted, color-coded by asset category and movement date. The kind of document that communicates its own credibility through its organization alone. Craig's face did something I watched very carefully. It didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that. But something behind it shifted. The specific shift of a man whose calculated assumption has just made contact with a wall he didn't know was there. Philip Marsh said, Could we have a moment? Catherine looked at her watch. You've had 11 months, she said pleasantly. But of course, the recess lasted 22 minutes. I sat in a side room with Catherine and a cup of coffee that I didn't drink and looked out the window at the March city. Catherine was calm. She is always calm. I have come to understand that her calm is not performed. It is the natural state of a person who has prepared so thoroughly that the room holds no surprises. He's going to come back with a counter, she said. Philip is going to try to characterize the consulting arrangement as legitimate compensation. He's going to argue the refinancing was a standard financial decision. He's going to say the account restructuring was administrative. And David's documentation addresses all 3 of those arguments before they're made. She paused. Craig built his case on the assumption that you didn't know what you were looking at. The forensic record assumes you do. When they came back into the room, Philip Marsh's composure had a different quality. Still professional, recalibrated. The composure of a man who has just understood that the case he walked in with is not the case he's working with anymore. Craig sat down. He looked at me again. Longer this time. I looked back. Same as before. Robert Gaines resumed the session. Philip Marsh began addressing the documents. His arguments were the ones Catherine had predicted, delivered in the sequence she'd anticipated, countered by David Rees' documentation before Philip finished making them. The consulting arrangement. Addressed. The refinancing. Addressed. The account restructuring. Addressed. The pattern from the first divorce. Catherine introduced it quietly, without drama, as context for the documented behavior. Philip Marsh objected to its relevance. Robert Gaines noted the objection and allowed it. Craig said very little for the rest of the session. That was the thing I noticed most. He had walked in prepared to speak. He had a version of events, a narrative, a story about modest assets and complicated income, and an equitable split that happened to land considerably in his favor. The documents didn't leave room for the narrative. Numbers don't have a narrative. That's the whole point of them. The settlement took 3 more sessions to finalize. I won't give you the specific number because it belongs to a legal agreement that isn't fully mine to summarize. What I can tell you is that the word modest did not appear in the final document. Neither did Craig's version of the consulting arrangement, the refinancing, or the account restructuring. David Rees submitted a final accounting summary to the mediator at the close of the 3rd session. Robert Gaines reviewed it. He looked at Craig's attorney over his reading glasses in the specific way of a man who has been doing this for 20 years and is no longer surprised, but is occasionally still struck by the audacity of a particular strategy. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Philip Marsh negotiated the final terms with Catherine in a tone that had changed considerably from the one he'd walked in with on the first day. Professional, precise. considerably less confident. Craig signed the final agreement on a Thursday afternoon. I wasn't in the room when he signed it. Catherine called me afterward. "It's done," she said. "How did he look?" I asked. She paused for a moment. "Like a man who spent 11 months building something very carefully and then found out the foundation was visible the whole time." I thanked her. "I meant it in the specific way you mean it when someone has spent 11 months standing between you and a version of your life that someone else designed for you." I want to tell you about the week after, because the week after is the part nobody asks about and the part I think about most. I went back to work. I sat in my C office on a Friday morning and reviewed Q1 projections with my team, and drank bad conference room coffee and argued about a logistics contract that needed renegotiating. Ordinary, functional, mine. My assistant, a woman named Becca who has worked with me for 4 years and who had watched the last 11 months from a professional distance with the focused loyalty of someone who understood what was at stake, without ever being told, knocked on my office door at the end of the day and set a very good bottle of wine on my desk. She didn't say anything. She just set it down and left. I laughed for the first time in 11 months. Craig called once, 2 weeks after the settlement. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 40 seconds long. He said he thought we could have handled things differently. He said he hoped I understood that he had only been trying to protect what he'd built. I listened to it once. Then I thought about Patricia Dunn, his first wife, the woman who had walked away cleanly, his words. I thought about what walking away cleanly had actually cost her. I thought about the version of that story Craig had told himself and everyone else for 15 years. I thought about the second time not being the first time and what that means about the distance between who someone presents themselves to be and who they actually are when the room is arranged in their favor. Then I deleted the voicemail. I have a window in my office that faces east. In the mornings, the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look specific and real and worth paying attention to. I sit at my desk and I review numbers that don't lie, and I manage a team that I built, and I drink better coffee than the conference room kind. Craig thought I was still the analyst, still attending, not presenting. He walked into that mediation room with 11 months of careful work and a very precise idea of how the story ended. He forgot that I'd been in the room the whole time, just watching, taking notes, waiting for Catherine to open her laptop. Here's what I want to say about this one. Philip Marsh is the detail everyone's going to skip over and nobody should. Craig had done this before. He had a playbook. That playbook required a lawyer who didn't ask too many questions about where the strategy came from. Philip Marsh walked into that mediation room not knowing that the case had already been built against his client's approach before his client's approach was even fully executed. That's what happens when you hire someone who knows commercial real estate law and bring them into a room where someone knows marital asset forensics. The real lesson is the question Catherine asks every client at the start. What does he think you don't know? Because that question is the whole case. Whatever lives in that gap between what he thinks you don't know and what you actually know, that's where the outcome is decided. Craig's gap was enormous. He'd been building it for 11 months thinking it was a shelter. It was actually a record. Document everything. Not loudly. Not as a threat. Just quietly and completely. The way David Reed does it. The way Catherine expects it. The way the forensic record requires it. Craig built his case on Simone's ignorance. She just made sure ignorance wasn't an option.